There are houses in England whose stones carry more history than most nations accumulate in centuries. They rise from the landscape not as intrusions, but as continuations of it, as though the land itself had slowly organized into halls and galleries and long gravel approaches lined with oak. The house at the center of this story was one such place. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, as it had for generations, with the quiet assurance of something that had never been required to justify its presence. The land on which the estate stood was granted during a period when England was still learning the shape of its own aristocratic order. The original grant came through service, as most early land transfers did, exchanging loyalty and military obligation for acres that stretched further than a man could walk in a single day. The family who received that land understood, even at the earliest stage of their tenure, that they were not merely acquiring property. They were accepting a position within a social architecture that would define them and bind them for as long as the name survived. The house that eventually rose on those grounds was built in stages, as great English houses almost always were. The earliest structure was modest by the standards that later generations would establish, a practical arrangement of stone and timber suited to the requirements of medieval administration and domestic life. Over the following centuries, wings were added and facades were altered to reflect the prevailing tastes of successive eras. By the time the house reached its most recognizable form, it presented a composed and symmetrical front to the world, its stonework weathered to a soft gray, its windows arranged with a regularity that suggested both restraint and confidence. The grounds were managed with the same deliberate attention. Formal gardens gave way to open parkland shaped by the principles of landscape design that came to define the English country estate in the 18th century. Trees were planted not merely for timber, but for effect, positioned to frame particular views and guide the eye toward the house from the principal approach. A walled kitchen garden supplied the household through every season. The whole arrangement communicated to anyone who understood its language that the family who lived here had occupied this position for a very long time and expected to continue doing so. Within English aristocratic society, the house carried a weight that extended well beyond its physical dimensions. The family had accumulated connections through marriage, political allegiance, and the careful management of local influence. They sat in parliament. They entertained at a scale that required planning months in advance. Their name appeared in correspondence across several counties, and their opinion on matters of land and governance alike was sought and recorded. They were, by any reasonable measure of the period, precisely the kind of family that English society had been constructed to sustain. That this would not always remain the case is a matter the following chapters will address in full.
Every great English house existed within a world that was larger than itself, shaped by forces that no single family, however well-positioned, could entirely control. The political climate, the economic currents, the shifting expectations of class and conduct, all of these pressed constantly against the walls of even the most established estates, demanding adaptation and, in certain periods, demanding sacrifice. To understand what eventually came to pass within this particular house, it is necessary first to understand the world it occupied at the moment of its greatest security. The period in question was one of surface stability and underlying tension. England in this era presented to the outside observer an image of ordered prosperity, its countryside managed, its institutions functioning, its social hierarchies appearing as natural and permanent as the landscape itself. The aristocracy occupied the upper register of that hierarchy with a confidence that had been centuries in the making. Land remained the primary measure of standing, and those families who held significant acreage held with it a form of authority that extended into politics, justice, and the organization of rural life at every level. The family at the center of this story had navigated that world with considerable success across multiple generations. Their estates had been managed with enough competence to avoid the kind of financial deterioration that had already begun to hollow out less attentive households. Marriages had been arranged with attention to both alliance and inheritance, knitting the family into networks of connection that stretched across county boundaries and into the corridors of political life in London. They were not the most powerful family in England, but they occupied a position that was recognized, respected, and assumed to be permanent. The principal figures of this period were formed entirely by the expectations of their class and century. The head of the household understood his role in terms that had changed little since his grandfather's time: the management of the estate, the maintenance of relationships with tenants and neighboring families, and the projection of a public character that reflected well on the name he carried. His wife managed the interior world of the house with equivalent seriousness, overseeing a domestic establishment that operated according to its own elaborate hierarchies and rhythms. Their children were educated, presented, and prepared for lives that would extend and continue what had already been built. What defined this generation, in retrospect, was not any particular achievement, but rather the completeness of their immersion in the social world they had inherited. They moved through it with the ease of people who had never been required to imagine an alternative. The house was full, the calendar was ordered, the obligations of the season were met year after year with the same careful attention. There was nothing in the outward appearance of the household and its routines or its relationships or the way it presented itself to the county that suggested anything other than continuity. The architecture of their lives, like the architecture of the house itself, appeared entirely sound. Every aristocratic household of any significant age carried within it a layer of life that was never intended for outside observation. This was not unique to any single family, nor was it regarded within the culture of the English upper classes as anything requiring particular justification. Privacy was considered not merely a preference, but a structural necessity, one of the foundational principles upon which the management of reputation, property, and lineage depended. What was kept from view was kept there deliberately, maintained through a combination of household loyalty, legal discretion, and the shared understanding that certain matters belonged entirely within the walls of the house. In the case of this particular family, the private dimensions of their history had been accumulating quietly for some years before any outward sign of difficulty became visible. The circumstances that would eventually bear so heavily upon them did not arrive suddenly or without precedent. They had developed gradually, in the manner of most serious institutional vulnerabilities, through a series of decisions and arrangements that each appeared manageable in isolation, but which, taken together, created a condition of considerable fragility. The family understood this, at least in part, and responded as families of their kind typically did, by containing the matter, managing its exposure, and maintaining the outward composure that their position required. The culture of aristocratic discretion that surrounded them was both a resource and a constraint. It provided the mechanisms through which difficult information could be managed, through trusted legal advisors, through carefully worded correspondence, through the quiet adjustment of financial and domestic arrangements that avoided public record wherever possible. Families of this standing had long understood how to move sensitive matters through private channels, and the infrastructure for doing so was well established. Solicitors, estate managers, and household staff all operated within a code of conduct that prioritized the continuity of the family's public reputation above most other considerations. What made this particular situation more delicate than others of its kind was the nature of the vulnerability itself. It did not concern money alone, though financial dimensions were present. It did not concern a single incident that might be managed and set aside. It concerned something that touched the family's position within the social order at a more fundamental level, something that, if it became widely known, would alter the way the household was perceived by precisely the people whose good opinion sustained it. The family had lived with this knowledge for long enough that it had become, in a sense, part of the structure of the household, an unspoken presence that shaped decisions without ever being named directly. The management of such a circumstance required a particular kind of vigilance, one that could not be relaxed without consequence. Documents were handled with care. Certain relationships were maintained at a careful distance. Particular subjects were understood among those closest to the family to exist outside the range of open discussion. The house continued to function exactly as it always had. The grounds were kept, the seasons passed, and beneath the composed and ordered surface of the estate, the private matter remained precisely where the family had placed it. To understand what the family had concealed, it is necessary to place the matter firmly within the social and legal conditions of the period in which they lived. Standards of conduct, reputation, and public morality were not abstract considerations for a family of this standing. They were operational realities, governing everything from political relationships to the terms on which marriages could be arranged and the degree of authority a household could exercise within its county. A family's name was, in the most practical sense, an asset, one that had been built across generations and that could be diminished or destroyed by disclosures that a later era might regard with considerably more tolerance. The particular circumstance at the heart of this story fell into a category that the English aristocracy of the period treated with acute seriousness. It was not a matter of financial mismanagement, though the financial consequences would prove severe. It was not a question of political allegiance, though the family's relationships in that sphere would be affected. The shame that had been so carefully managed within the walls of the house concerned conduct that ran directly against the moral and legal expectations placed upon families of their class. Expectations that were enforced not through sympathy or flexibility, but through the swift and often permanent withdrawal of social standing. The historical record from this period provides sufficient evidence to reconstruct the nature of the matter with reasonable clarity. Contemporary correspondence, legal documents, and the private papers of connected families all point toward a situation that the household had been managing, with diminishing success, for a considerable number of years. The details, examined against the standards of the time, reveal why concealment had been considered the only viable course. Exposure would have meant not merely embarrassment, but the effective termination of the family's place within the social worlds they had inhabited for centuries. What the documents also reveal is the degree to which the family's response to their situation was shaped by the legal frameworks of the period. English law in this era treated certain categories of conduct with considerable severity, and the consequences of formal legal exposure extended well beyond personal reputation into the realm of property, inheritance, and civic standing. The family's legal advisors had been engaged precisely to manage this dimension of the risk, and the arrangements they constructed were, for a time, sufficient to contain it. That they eventually proved insufficient is a reflection not of any single failure, but of the accumulating pressure that concealment of this kind inevitably generates. It is worth observing at this point in the narrative that the family were not unusual in finding themselves in such a position. The historical record of the English aristocracy contains numerous households that carried comparable burdens through comparable periods, managing private circumstances that stood in direct tension with their public obligations. What distinguished this particular house was not the nature of the shame itself, but the scale of what its eventual exposure would cost. The family had built too much across too many generations for the loss to be anything other than total. The process by which private matters become known is rarely a single event. It does not, in most cases, arrive as a sudden rupture, but rather as a gradual erosion, a slow movement of information from the contained interior of a household outward into the wider social world, passing through successive layers of proximity until it reaches those whose knowledge of it carries genuine consequence. In the case of this family, the unraveling followed precisely that pattern. It was not dramatic in its early stages. It was quiet, incremental, and for a considerable period, still potentially manageable. The first indications that the family's carefully maintained arrangements were under strain appeared not in any public forum, but in the private correspondence of those closest to the household. Letters from this period, preserved among the papers of connected families and legal offices, begin to reflect a changed tone in references to the house and its principal members. The warmth and ease of earlier decades gives way to something more measured, a language of careful distance that those familiar with the social codes of the period would have recognized immediately as a withdrawal of confidence. Nothing was stated directly, nothing needed to be. The shift in register was itself the message. The legal dimension of the unraveling followed at some remove from the social one. Certain arrangements that had been constructed to manage the family's exposure began to encounter the kind of scrutiny that private agreements cannot easily survive. A change in legal personnel, the death of a long-serving advisor, a financial transaction that required external review, any one of these could introduce into the management of a private matter the kind of outside attention that the family had spent years avoiding. The historical record suggests that more than one such pressure arrived within a relatively compressed period, leaving the household with fewer instruments of containment than it had previously relied upon. What is notable about the family's response during this period is its consistency with everything that had come before. They did not retreat visibly from public life. The estate continued to function. Seasonal obligations were met. The outward calendar of the household proceeded without apparent disruption. This was, in one sense, a testament to the depth of the family's training and the management of appearances. In another sense, it was a measure of how completely their understanding of their situation was shaped by the same culture of discretion that had created their difficulties. They responded to exposure with the only tools they had ever been given. The point at which containment ceased to be possible arrived not through any single act of disclosure, but through the convergence of several lines of pressure that the family could no longer address separately. Legal proceedings in one quarter, social withdrawal in another, and the particular vulnerability that accompanies financial strain when it coincides with reputational damage, all of these reached a condition of simultaneous visibility that the household could not absorb. The matter that had been managed within the walls of the house for so long had, by this stage, moved beyond those walls entirely. What remained was the question of what the exposure would cost.
When an ancient English house falls, it does not fall all at once. The process is measured and sequential, moving through distinct stages that each carry their own particular character of loss. First, the relationships withdraw. Then the finances contract. Then the property itself begins its slow passage out of family hands. And finally, the name, which had once organized so much of the surrounding world, quietly ceases to carry the weight it once did. For this family, the consequences of exposure followed that progression with a thoroughness that left very little behind. The estate itself was the most visible casualty of what had occurred. Houses of this kind were not simply residential properties. They were administrative centers, social institutions, and repositories of accumulated material culture, their contents representing not merely financial value, but the physical evidence of a family's presence across time. The dispersal of such a house, whether through forced sale, legal settlement, or the gradual disposal of assets under financial pressure, carries a particular character of finality that straightforward economic transactions do not. Each item removed from the inventory represented the severance of another connection between the family and the world they had constructed around themselves. The financial dimensions of the collapse were considerable and, in certain respects, self-reinforcing. The withdrawal of social confidence had practical consequences that extended into the family's economic relationships. Credit arrangements that had operated for years on the basis of the family's standing became more difficult to sustain once that standing was in question. Estate revenues, already under the pressures common to aristocratic landholding in this period, could not absorb the additional burdens that the family's circumstances now imposed. Legal costs accumulated. Certain income streams that had depended on relationships now damaged by the exposure ceased to function as they previously had. The financial structure of the household, which had appeared adequate for so long, revealed itself to be considerably more fragile than its outward condition had suggested. The departure of family members from the estate followed the financial deterioration with a quietness that was in its own way as telling as any more dramatic form of dissolution.
There were no recorded scenes of leave-taking, no documented expressions of grief or resistance. The historical record simply reflects, across a period of several years, the gradual thinning of the household, the reduction of staff, the closing of rooms, the cessation of the seasonal patterns that had organized life on the estate for generations. The house that had once required a substantial domestic establishment to maintain its operations became, by degrees, a much smaller and quieter place. The property itself passed from family hands through a legal process that attracted little public attention. By the time the transfer was completed, the circumstances surrounding it were sufficiently well understood within the relevant social circles that no further commentary was considered necessary. The new ownership brought with it different purposes and different associations. The long gravel approach, the composed stone facade, the parkland arranged so carefully to frame the view, all of it remained physically intact. What had departed was the particular human history that had given the place its meaning.
Time has a particular way of treating the memory of fallen houses. It does not erase them completely, nor does it preserve them with any great fidelity. What survives is fragmentary, a collection of documents in county archives, a name recorded in parish registers, a section of walling visible at the edge of a field that was once a formal garden, the faint impression of an approach road readable in the contours of a landscape that has long since been reorganized for other purposes. These remnants do not tell the full story. They suggest it, incompletely, to those who know how to read what remains when everything of substance has been removed. The archival record of this family is, in itself, a form of testimony. What survives in solicitors' papers, estate correspondence, and the private collections of connected households reflects not only what happened, but the way in which the household chose to manage its own documentation during the period of its difficulty. Certain papers were clearly retained with care. Others show evidence of selective preservation, gaps in correspondence that align with the most sensitive phases of the family's history. Absences that are as informative to the trained reader as the documents that remain. The archive, in other words, bears the same marks of careful management that characterized the family's conduct throughout the period this documentary has examined. In the landscape itself, the evidence is quieter still. The estate's principal structure did not survive intact into the present century. The sequence of ownership changes that followed the family's departure brought with them alterations, reductions, and eventually the kind of neglect that large stone buildings do not easily recover from. What remains of the physical fabric is modest relative to what the historical record describes, enough to confirm the general dimensions and character of the original house, but not enough to convey the full weight of what once stood there. The parkland has been absorbed into agricultural use. The walled garden is partially intact but long since repurposed. The approach that was once designed to produce a specific impression on an arriving visitor now leads to nothing that would prompt that response. Local memory, where it persists at all, has softened the story considerably. The particular circumstances that drove the family's decline are not widely recalled in the surrounding area, and where fragments of the story do survive in local tradition, they have been simplified and, in some cases, romanticized in the manner that oral history tends to apply to the ruins of former grandeur. The shame that was so operationally significant to the family and their contemporaries has, across the passage of generations, been reduced to atmosphere, a vague sense of misfortune attached to a name that fewer and fewer people now recognize. What the story of this house ultimately contributes to the broader history of the English aristocracy is a precise and quietly instructive example of institutional fragility. The family had built, across centuries, a position that appeared self-sustaining, supported by land, connection, legal arrangement, and the deep cultural investment of an entire social class in the perpetuation of houses like theirs. That it proved insufficient is not a dramatic conclusion. It is simply an honest one. The stones remain, the name does not.